So no thumbs up. It's a good start. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining this session on the community participation and the RDA COVID-19 recommendations and guidelines. Let's see. Yeah, please feel free to say hello in the chat and where you come from. So all type of interaction is more than welcome and encouraged. So hi, Hugh. My name is Timea Bairo. I work for the Digital Repository of Ireland, and I've been one of the co-chairs of the community participation subgroup under the broader COVID-19 working group. And I have with me a few colleagues that have worked on community participation on a radical collaboration paper. And we thought that this would be a good opportunity for, so the plenary would be a good opportunity for us to bring again the topic to the wider RDA community and share a little bit of the thoughts and the considerations that we sort of got into during this this journey. So just a few housekeeping points. The session is being recorded. To better view the slides that you're seeing now and the ones that Brian will share later, you should be able to click on the expand button that's right at the bottom of your, of the frame that is connected to the slides. We encourage you to use the chat and also the Q&A if you feel more comfortable with that. We will have an open discussion in the second part of the session. So we encourage you to turn on your camera during that time, but please mute your microphone when you are not speaking because that sometimes causes echoes and other things. So just a little bit of, it might help with the sound. We do have a session page that you can look at. It's got a couple of good references that you might be interested in looking at. So there's a short link there that you can follow. And we do have collaborative notes document just to capture a couple of the ideas that we will be discussing. I think Mary has already, yes, thank you, Mary she has already shared the collaborative notes link. So feel free to follow that and add any points that that would be interesting or that you want to highlight. So just to set the scene, the objective of our session is to have an open conversation about the experience of developing the guidelines, the RDA recommendations and guidelines, and exploring the potential relevance that these might have for RDA and other similar initiatives that would be addressing global challenges like that. So for the agenda today, we were looking at two papers. So one of them is what we call the summary paper. And the second one is the paper on radical collaboration that Brian is going to talk to us a little bit more about. Then we're going to have an open discussion about this, and we'll see what would be next steps if we decide to take forward the activities on their potential and the potential outputs from the group. So just to highlight a few points on the summary paper, the paper has been focused on bringing forward a few key points regarding the recommendations and the guidelines and some relevant findings, and to shine a spotlight on the entire process and see how these developments can be leveraged for the wider scientific community. This has been an unprecedented cross-disciplinary, cross-sectorial and cross-jurisdictional effort and has been authored by more than 160 experts from around the globe. So we thought just to highlight a few points from the summary paper. This has been an example, as you can see, of incredible multidisciplinary work, a bottom-up and cross-geographical effort. It has bridged STEM and social sciences work to provide valuable insights. It has used a very lightweight structure with relatively simple and widely used tools to facilitate the work. Each of the subgroups has had their own meeting plans, but there have been a lot of cross collaboration mechanisms. The multiple drafts and releases process has been very good to focus on the writing coordination and to ensure the free flow of information. And the subgroups have worked in a tandem, but we have had our group of editors who have ensured the consistency across the structure and the approach, and have helped refine the contributions. So a few of the things that we thought were extremely important to highlight in relation to this experience is the fact that the actual recommendations have had low level of moderation, but at the same time they were expert informed and community reviewed through this process. The repeated consultations have provided a fast track path to the wider adoption, and a lot of the categories of the stakeholders that were interested in the adoption have been engaged from the beginning. There is a global willingness among the experts to support this sort of activities. So I put in there a nice quote that I thought was very interesting. It's from the actual summary paper. It's just to highlight that this experience has made it clear that to a great extent, the knowledge, the expertise, and the solutions for working together in face of global emergencies is already in place. And I might add that through structures like the RDA. So we need to foster this sort of coordination, harmonization, and decision-making process. So these were a few of the things that we wanted to bring forward in the conversation about community participation. And we hope to maybe broaden that discussion during the open discussion section of this session. So this was just a little bit of an introduction to what we call the summary paper. I think Hugh, who has followed that exercise, is on the call with us. I don't know, Hugh, would you like to maybe add something to that? It was a lot of information, but I'm hoping that it has set some, it has highlighted some key points, especially from the point of view of the community participation. So please.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this to me, I think you kind of nicely captured what was said there in terms of what was said in the summary paper. Thinking about the experience, it was I mean, the level of consultation that we had to do was perhaps much more than you might expect for that. And I kind of, you know, I don't think I've said as many times in calls use the word consensus. Do we have a consensus for, you know, with something that was there? But again, you know, it's that thing about everybody approaching it was really important there. And you know, it's, I think the other issue was, you know, trying to do that summary was quite tricky to try and do that, to try and get that snapshot right. And it took a lot of things. And it's, in fact, just to stress, it's only now that we've resubmitted, you know, gone through the comments from the referees and have just fired that back. So it, you know, again, these things, this operation takes time as well. Now, to me, I don't know if that was the right thing that you wanted to talk about, but yeah, that's the, I mean, I think you kind of get the content of it pretty covered there in the slide.
Well, that's very useful, Hugh. Yes, that was what we were hoping for, since you were the driver behind this experience, and I'm the summary paper. I mean, at this point, yeah, there are also not with us that we should be thanking for, and I'm thinking Claire and Jetta on our side, especially on the radical collaboration paper. So, yeah. Okay, I will close on that point unless there are any questions, but I think it might be better to address these in the open discussion section. So I'll stop sharing my screen and you can take over, Brian. Thank you, Hugh. Thank you.
Sorry, until I'm not a computer scientist. Anyway. So there we go. This is about the paper, one of the papers which Timea mentioned, namely the radical collaboration around the work which we did to produce the data sharing recommendations during the first half of last year. My name is Brian Pickering. I'm a cyber psychologist, which doesn't mean I do therapy for robots, but I'm interested in behavior online. I'm also a research ethicist. And so I was, as well as being part of the social science working group, I co-moderated the legal and ethical considerations group. I'm just one of many, as you can see here. We did collaborate very closely. It was all pulled together by Timea and some amazing editing work by Claire. So just as a reminder, at the back end of 2019, we started to hear rumors and indeed confirmed news stories that there was something unpleasant going on in China. By the end of January, Europe had already seen its first cases. It was one of those sort of flashbulb memory moments for me. I was actually with one of my brothers and his wife, and we watched people being brought back from Wuhan. And then by the end of March, or during March, the World Health Organization actually declared it a pandemic. So that's the background. In March as well, the European Commission approached RDA and asked to develop some specific guidelines for data sharing. And by the 30th of June, after 5 iterations, much blood, sweat and tears, we published the final set of recommendations and guidelines. So, you know, as I'm going through this, I'd like to think, given that context, what would you have done? And more specifically, how would all of this made you feel? So just to summarize, this is what we did in putting together the recommendations themselves. As Timea already said, this was a collaboration across different disciplines. The clinical, the omics, and the epidemiology was obvious. Here is a pandemic. This is a respiratory illness, etc., etc. But of course, this had social implications, which is why social science is there. Having said that, and Timea, of course, was one of the leaders on the community participation group. There was a social context which we needed to take into account. So there was a community participation section, as well as looking at indigenous populations who were particularly vulnerable at this time. And then at the same time, Hugh was actually pulling together the research software. You can't share data effectively, you can't reuse data effectively without appropriate software. And my own, one of my own engagements was with legal and ethical considerations, looking at how we could provide guidelines for people to effectively share their data. As was kind of intimated, 600 RDA members came together. This was my first experience with RDA, so there were existing and new members. 164 people worked directly on drafting, editing, and finalizing the document. As of this morning, the document had been read 26,500 times. So it's a significant piece of work. Now, when we were coming to think about what had actually happened, how we had pulled together all of this work together, We were minded by one of our collaborators, Minglu in Canada, that there was this concept of radical collaboration. Tam and Luyet in the States were lawyers, mediation lawyers, who had had a lot of experience in bringing together different parties and helping them work through the problems that they had. They were particularly interested in the fact that people had to drop their defenses. It's important to be open and honest, but you can't be defensive in any of this. So Kim Scott picked up on this in her book on radical candor, suggesting mechanisms that we can actually be heard without being regarded as aggressive and making the other people become defensive. And then, of course, in 2018, Nancy McGovern picked up on the idea, and specifically around research data management, which is, of course, what we were doing, looked at how radical collaboration was important for sharing of data. And so effectively, Nancy McGovern came up with the application of radical collaboration within this sphere, and said, as Timea has already intimated, that you've got a lot of people here. And of course, once you get experts together, you've got a lot of egos as well. They're uncomfortable in this collaborative environment. As Hugh mentioned, it was important to get consensus. It was actually important not just that people agree, but that they should be heard from their different disciplinary areas. But that's not an easy thing to manage. We were talking about cats before the session. It's a bit like herding cats, as we say in English. And so we had Nancy McGovern picks up on three basic tenets. The work has to be distributed, and obviously during the pandemic, none of us could go into the office, and indeed we wouldn't have been able to travel anyway. It needs to be collaborative because you're bringing together these different people who have a voice, and they need to feel part of, so that's the inclusiveness piece. So on the basis of that, we thought, well, this clearly was successful, if exhausting. So how could we capture that experience, and how could we understand where people had, what their experience was, how we could take that forward? I asked you at the beginning, how would you feel about that? What would you have done? And so we wanted to answer some of those questions. There were obviously three constructs that we had to investigate, given Nancy McGovern's work on radical collaboration in research data management, namely inclusiveness, distributed practices, and collaboration. And around that, we put together a 19-item anonymous survey. There were a lot of Likert type questions, there were categorical questions, and then there were 5 free-form open-ended questions where people were typing exactly what they wanted. We had 69 responses altogether. One didn't actually say anything at all. They were obviously just looking at the survey, and so we ended up analysing 68 of the responses. If you think about the 164 core team, if you like, the people who edited and put together and the recommendations themselves, that's roughly around 20%. And one of my favourite quotations from the free-form areas is this, the work was about, was a service to God and humanity. And one of the reasons that stuck with me so much was because, of course, you tend to have a bias towards the developed world, the Western world, and this is not something that people would necessarily say. However, this was an environment where people felt comfortable enough to be able to be honest. So some of the challenges which people highlighted, time was obviously an issue. In some respects, it was about time zones, and of course, I know there are people attending here, and this is not necessarily during a sociable time for them. That was an issue. It was an issue for scheduling. But in addition to that, the pace of the work that we carried out was particularly challenging. People felt that they couldn't necessarily provide up-to-date information because the timescales were so tight. There was an issue about commitment. Yes, we want to be part, we want to give our expertise, but on the other hand, all of this work is being handled on top of the constraints that we have working remotely, trying to keep, in my case, research going, etc. And then finally, there were issues around participation. So these were the three main areas. In participatory considerations, there were people who felt frustrated. There were people who were aware that experts and collaborators had come in early on, but then just didn't continue to collaborate for whatever reason. So there were some challenges around the work we did, and people were fairly honest and happy to come forward on that. And one of the interesting things which came up in one of the questions was that people mentioned the issue about authorship. Certainly for the academics, one of the ways of demonstrating that we've actually done a reasonable job are the publications that we get. And there was a feeling, as you can see, that there was an appropriate sort of discussion around who should be author, what order they should be in those kind of things. And of course, to a certain extent, this goes back to the defensiveness that Tam and Luya were talking about. In these radical collaboration situations, people can be defensive. And in the case of academics and experts, they're saying, hang on, what am I getting out of it? Because authorship would be one thing. But at the same time, and as I said at the beginning, I'm a psychologist, so I was interested in the motivation, and we saw a lot of that coming through quite clearly in some of the free-form responses. There is a theory by J.C. and Ryan that goes back to 2000, but then it's been developed in different areas since then, which talks about the types of motivation that get people to do things originally in an educational environment. So what was really going on for these people? Okay, we've been asked by the EC to put together these recommendations. We were collaborating in different groups, bringing our expertise to the table. There was an editorial team who honed all of that, and we ended up with this rather neat and elegant document, and the work led by Hugh. There is also a summary out there so that people can see what the work was all about, and then lead that into reading the document itself. But at the same time, there was a community. There was a social context for all of this. People, as we all know, in lockdown had a whole bunch of issues going on for them. They were seeing things around them which they had not seen before and which were incredibly uncomfortable, as well as the addition of other things like working remotely, dealing with your children, dealing with family members at the same time. There has been a significant amount of work within the social sciences, identifying that, there are big problems, but having said that, people are adaptable and can get over it. We had the cases in Italy, for example, of people who were not allowed to leave their homes, but nevertheless were opening their windows and singing together. And so there was quite a lot of work that was going on in the background, not necessarily as part of RDA, but that we could draw on. And coming back to motivation, if you think about these comments about authorship, as an academic, I want to be able to cite the papers that I've had a significant contribution to. These are extrinsic motivations. Namely, they come from outside. And these are things that, so it's money, it's recognition, it's people knowing that I'm a good egg and things like this, so it's my social standing. But as soon as they are removed, then they go away. They're no longer motivators. So it's fine that I get a publication, but once it's out there, I'm looking at the next one and I'm no longer motivated to that. That's the point of extrinsic motivation. On the other hand, there are these intrinsic motivators, namely, how do I feel about this? What is really driving me? And the reason that that's important, and I'll come on to why I'm mentioning this in a moment, is because these are the things which make me tick, and these are the things which make me volunteer, which make me step out of my comfort zone. And so what was going on, we have indications that people irrespective of the challenges, the time zones, the scheduling, the fast pace of the work that was going on, the lack of accreditation, the frustrations around participation, all of those things. It was important to people to be part of, and because they were part of this network, they were sharing information and experiences. They were opening up areas that I as a psychologist would not necessarily have known about, and everybody was working towards a common goal, which in social terms is really important, because what this is actually saying is that I can see other people who are committed and who are working really hard to be able to make a contribution, and so that is actually a motivator, because I want to be part, I want to be included in this community. And so the overriding thing, all of these quotations, of course, from what we found from those 68 responses, this was felt to be meaningful work. The overwhelming response was that this was important because it meant that I could actually, not just me personally, but in a rhetorical sense, I was making a contribution to a significant piece of work during really challenging times, and that was the motivator. So if you think about it, going back to the question, the rhetorical question at the beginning, how did you feel at the beginning of the pandemic? How would you feel now, having done this kind of collaboration? And perhaps more importantly, how can organizations like the RDA learn from this experience, but also share that experience to highlight why people wish to engage and why people are prepared to go that extra mile? So we found, it was all about radical collaboration to start off with. The Tamanluya thesis that people need to drop their guard, they need to be prepared to step out of their comfort zone, and then McGovern taking this into the data management area. But there was something else going on. This was set against some of the most difficult times that we've seen. I don't wish to be political, but governments didn't necessarily respond well, but of course they didn't know what they were doing. But people wanted to feel that they could make a contribution, that they could belong to a broader community, even though they could not physically get close to the communities that they knew. And so ultimately this was all about the experts, the volunteers coming together and saying, this is a difficult time. I have no control on what is happening around me. However, in actually giving freely of my own expertise into a community where it comes together as something meaningful, this helps me to cope with the problems that I'm facing in my day-to-day life. So there we go. Thank you for your attention. Thank you to all of the people who contributed here. And just one final thing. One of the consequences of lockdown is that I've got far too much time to mess around with the look and feel of slides. But I'll leave it there and I'll hand back. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Brian. That was excellent. And it's a discussion time now, and I welcome you if you want to, of course, and I hope you do want. Please switch on your cameras and mics and join me on this stage. Hi, Natalie. Thanks.
I have a I've been involved in this process, but I'm curious, Brian, this is the toughest question, I think. What is the balance between intrinsic motivations, in this case, intrinsic motivation for the working group, as you've described it, versus crisis-based intrinsic? Because I know for me getting involved in the beginning, it was the sense of helplessness at the overwhelming nature of the pandemic, and that as a person working on a social science and humanities repository, what can I possibly do? I felt completely useless. And then when this came around, that changed things. It was something to contribute to. But how do we harness that into intrinsic motivations that go beyond a pandemic situation? Easy question.
Thank you. I'll be sending my professional bill later on. No, I mean, you hit the nail on the head right at the beginning there. There were a lot of people who felt like you, that, you know, we're helpless. We don't know what we do. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to cope with this. And so this was an opportunity to get involved. In moving forward, then what we really need to think about is how do we formalize, if you like, that kind of motivation? How do we encourage the social side of it? And I don't mean, you know, sort of coffee and things like that, but it's actually what people were coming forward with was, this gives me an opportunity to talk to people that I wouldn't necessarily have. And this is, you know, this is a comfort zone, if you like, certainly for an academic or an expert. So I think moving forward, it's all about creating that social environment which encourages people to engage, to exchange ideas, and also to learn from others. And that's when they get the benefit. To a certain extent, and I don't wish to undermine the work we did, the work that we came out with, the recommendations, was secondary. Once people found that they were getting this, you know, they were actually getting much more, which said to them, you can do something in this crisis situation.
Secondary, but maybe, but I would say people were so committed and working around the clock and at a really intense energy that I know I, for one, could not replicate the energy I put into that then now. Like, I don't have it anymore. It's not there this further away in the pandemic, right? So it may have been secondary, but there was a drive towards excellence as well. So that's, I think, the motivation shows that it's not like the group nature and the belonging took over for the sense of wanting to do the best possible or make the best possible output that one could. I don't want to dominate, but so but I'm so fascinated by it.
Okay, two very quick observations. One, if you think about it, as we go into lockdown, we don't know what's happening. Nevertheless, we have effectively, there is all this energy, and you saw it in unfortunate, I don't wish to be political, that's not my area, but you saw it in unfortunate things, like in the UK, people pushing statues over and things like this during the response to what was going on in the States. And a lot of that was literally getting rid of, you know, here is all this pent up frustration, and so we get rid of it. And so therefore we are driven, because we have this energy to go the extra mile. And yes, we did work really, really hard, and no, I wouldn't be able to sustain that level. The second thing, though, is yes, people were going for excellence, because this was a forum where they could do what they know how to do well, and they were in control of. Whereas in the pandemic itself, they had no control. They didn't know what was going to happen. They were watching loved ones around them suffer, and they had no control over that. However, you know, as somebody who proofreads, etc., all of a sudden I'm given this opportunity to be able to go through these things and pull it out. It's almost a relief. So those are my responses.
Yes, please, Hugh.
Yeah. So, Brian, first of all, I haven't been attending the community participation things, and it's just phenomenal kind of seeing this insight. This is something that I know absolutely nothing about, and it's really, really interesting to hear this. The point about the intrinsic and extrinsic is really interesting, because I think the RDA, the COVID-19 document is really struck me as, yeah, that's all intrinsic. You know, everybody was like, this is gives us something to do, okay? But then it's, for me, there was like this almost immediate switch over. We started thinking about the summary document, because that was something which was going into a peer-reviewed document, a peer-reviewed journal. And indeed, I mean, I think nobody if I'd known this before, I mean, that we realized that this was a definite sort of step change. So where before everybody was like, just muck in, do your bit, don't worry about accreditation and so on. Summary paper, we have to make sure that everybody is properly cited and so on. So we spent a number of weeks before we even started the work kind of agonizing about how are we going to give people their, put down the author list names. They were very, very passionate discussions about where we should be submitting the publications, in terms of, people saying, no, we should not be trying to send it to pay for journals. It's for only, and I really, really get those. So standing back in terms of that process, was that the right way of doing it? That kind of quite formal, here are recommendations, this is how the paper will be organized, you have to sign up, and then we give you a timeline, a deadline to contribute to this, and so on? Or would there have been more efficient ways that in that step of really saying, we're now going to produce an output which is good for people's careers, but put kind of in a very, very blunt way? It'd be good to see if you have any thoughts there.
Okay, I mean, they are thoughts, because of course we didn't ask people during those follow-on papers how they felt, but as you describe it, and I mean, my own observation is that's exactly right. We'd done this phenomenal piece of work in getting the RDA data sharing recommendations out in a very short period of time. And so then we go back to the normal modus operandi. And so that we're just a bunch of academics arguing, trying to structure things. And my observation, and it's just my personal observation, is that the energy level dropped in the sense that you didn't have all of these people prepared to contribute and pull things together. Those teams were a lot smaller, and the active collaboration was a lot smaller. So it was kind of a step change. We'd done all of this work, which, as far as the survey is concerned, was intrinsically motivated. People wanted to do it, they wanted to be a part of, etc. But then once you're doing these sort of the follow-on pieces, people had lost that impetus, and it was more business as usual. But those are just my observations. We should ask people about that, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's really a time which we called open discussion. So we do encourage everyone to join us on this. I don't know how to say stage. It's not stage. If you want to switch on your camera and your mic and participate in the discussion. And looking back at RDA COVID-19 recommendations and guidelines, we would like to talk about 2 blocks of questions, what we learned from this process and how that could be useful to RDA, and then also look beyond RDA, how would that be useful to our communities, our countries, and that's the reason we structured questions relevant to the RDA and beyond. And then would like to spend some time discussing next steps. And I was one of co-moderators of the social sciences part, together with Amy Pienter and Brian Ingwill, Claudia, and many more people on this. I don't even know how to say on this session today. We're also part of social sciences discussion. And what was really important for us, that it was beyond obvious research disciplines that responded to pandemic. It was really about cross-disciplinary collaboration and making sure that social effect is also captured and is part of immediate response discussions. And that was extremely useful for me because I learned a lot from other disciplines. And I don't know if we could think of another situation where we could really learn from this cross-disciplinary approach. And I think RDA is really uniquely positioned. And thanks, Kieran, for responding to my call and for joining with your video and mic.
I'd like to make an observation. I mean, the coming together to put the guidelines together was, fantastic experience, I think, for most people involved in it, and the energy that was there, as everyone said, was phenomenal. But I think trying to sort of ask that first question you got up on there, that was in one sense an extraordinary situation. We had this existential challenge that was there for everybody, and everyone was needing, as you observed, Brian, to contribute, to feel belonged. There were a lot of lessons learned out of it, and how do we then take that onto and move it into the RDA in more general? I think the challenge I see is that in the normal state, in RDA, it's a voluntary thing. We're doing it on top of our day jobs. We have an interest in a topic, so we join the interest groups or working groups. But in the priority list, that starts to drop down, and I'm really thinking that what you talked about, Brian, about the intrinsic rewards coming back, that's probably the area that we need to focus in on and try to find things that will give that. It's probably not the same things that you got from the pandemic situation and drawing those guidelines, because there were different drivers there that gave you that. There was this global crisis, and every little bit that you did, you felt like you contributed to something really, to humanity, as somebody said in the comments there. You can't say that when you're working on some other, in most of the other working groups, right? So, really trying to find some of those intrinsic rewards that people can get from the working groups, the interest groups. I think that would be one way of looking at it. But it might also come back to a more fundamental thing about, when the RDA is when you're trying to set up these working groups and interest groups, is there a way of measuring how we do get that intrinsic value for people? Maybe that's a thing to think about as we're creating these interest groups. So yeah, that's my thoughts on this.
Okay, maybe I can just jump in then. I'm sorry, I don't dare to put on my camera after I lost all the connection I did. So obviously Juno doesn't seem to like me live. So I hope you can bear with it this way. I would like to add on to what also Natalie and also what Karen addressed with regard to the intrinsic motivation. I think this is quite interesting, because I've always experienced the RDA community as being very intrinsic in the first place, in general, sharing this, everybody I've always met and worked with, sharing this basic idea that we all work towards data sharing and the open science, and that's basic the commitment and the dedication that make all of us kind of devote so much time to it, which most of us don't have in the first place. Having said this, I think the other discussion, which is so interesting, being a social scientist working in war regions and global crisis on a daily basis, I think when we see this in the broader term of what we can do and contribute to the global challenges and humanities, even beyond the pandemic. I think it's a bit strange that we need a pandemic to find a motivation to contribute, to find intrinsic motivation to work on this and share what we know on a daily basis. And maybe one of the ways of not challenging, but channeling the experience we've done now so far with the pandemic is that we can see how in normal times we can actually utilize what we've learned and the experience and the competences that we did make during the pandemic to see that as a unique support and thereby as an intrinsic motivation to be prepared for similar or different kinds of global crises that come up on short term, because they will come, being it climate or pandemics or wars or whatever. So I would believe from the experience I've done throughout the pandemic work that if we manage to play on that in future, we would manage to keep the intrinsic motivation of the members on a constant basis. Of course, not the way we maybe have had it till now, but still on a high level. And I can just invite everybody to get involved in the SDGs, which are addressing a lot of the global challenges. And then at the same time, see how we can utilize this experience and the work to what the Council presented yesterday as a part of the products that the RDA can offer to the worldwide community and to the high-level actors like the UN, OECD, World Health Organization, and so on. Because I think we have a lot to contribute there. And I think maybe that could be a good intrinsic motivation too.
Thanks a lot, Ingvild. And you mentioned climate, and is a discussion that Creative Commons communities having now, climate changes, and whether it's really the right time to start responding to all the issues and challenges. So it could be, I don't know whether it's good to say another pandemic, or it could be just climate change. That could be another, I don't know, big topic for the RDA to respond to. And I think that question, what were the RDA's strengths? It is a collaborative platform. We know already how to send out a call to community and request for input. We have all these workflows and processes in place with routine moderation and meetings and writing sprints. And also we even have a document format. Like, for example, if we want to produce guidelines and recommendations on data sharing for climate changes, I think we could just take the structure and I don't know, see where we could replace COVID-19 with climate related questions. And of course, I'm simplifying it because, as you can see, I'm a sociologist, so I probably know as much about climate changes as about COVID-19 specific issues. But like, I don't know, but I think that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. And please, everyone who have just joined us, participate in the discussion. And it's not just the three of us talking. The idea is that everyone in the session could switch on camera and mic and be part of the discussion. I think we addressed a bit this cross-disciplinary angle. And apologies, we have a heavy rain outside, so hope it's not too loud for you. There is also another question in the end of the slides, and it's about ethical dimension. So let me read it again. Is an ethical imperative of the RDA to provide open, neutral forum that enables community to work on the global and regional level. And I guess this neutral part was was an important topic for us when we were planning a session, because of course we were not the only ones who responded to COVID-19 pandemic as a global movement, but I think we have this privilege of providing a neutral voice and contribution. Anyone would like to comment on that?
I think if I may, I mean, I certainly agree that organizations like the RDA have an ethical responsibility, especially given the reach and the facilities provided by the RDA and its experience to encourage participation. One of the things which I think we need to take forward out of what happened during the putting together the recommendations was the global participation. There were these sort of logistical issues for people in Australia, for example, to participate. So you only got the 1 or 2 people who would be prepared to get up in the morning at dreadful hours and things like that. But that's one practical issue, to make sure that everybody in all communities has access to the facilities and to be able to share and voice their opinions.
Thanks, and thanks for your comment, Natalie. Yeah, I agree with you. It's plural is perhaps a better word than neutral, because if you have plurality, you could be closer to neutral. And Anne, would you like to contribute? So we have another plus from Kieran about plural. So let's make sure that we write this in collaborative notes.
Yeah,
and please.
Yeah, you can hear me?
Yes.
I camera because yesterday that was just awful. I was kicked out. What I wanted to say is just that from this experience, there are some structural lessons for structural functioning of RDA that can be taken, like some comment in the chat about that, about the subgroups. And I know that when the subgroups were created, there was no, there were groups, RDA logic, because subgroups just could not exist in the system. And I think this was one of the richness of the group, that we had to have all these subgroups, and then the meetings together, at least the moderators and so on. So there is something which is, I think, has been very key to the production of something, could be used in other topics or in other situation, and that could be, that has the RDA. You need to revise maybe the in the informatics system to be able to have subgroups officially in the system. And I say that because from my experience in some other groups we actually function in subgroups, but this is hidden. We used private channels for exchange and so on. So it is not really apparent, but that it exists in other groups, non-officially, when it was official, I would say, in this COVID-19, thinking that there is something to dig there for RDA.
That's an excellent point. Thanks a lot, Sarah. Anything else on the RDA part? Because then we can move on to beyond RDA. So perhaps last minute. Well, I mean, it's not like last minute, but Anything else you'd like to add to that? Then if not, if we could have a look at the next block.
Maybe, sorry, before we
Yeah.
move on.
Please.
I was thinking also, so Brian touched upon it shortly, but the issues around inclusiveness, I think, are also something that we might have to, or at least look at from the perspective of the questions that are related to RDA. So actually the exercise and the survey and the entire radical collaboration framework kind of brought to light so many levels, at least for me, so many levels of inclusiveness, and the answers also. I think, Brian, you mentioned a few of the unexpected answers related to inclusiveness, things that quite often are not considered. So yeah, I think my point is that would be also one of the areas that might be interested in looking into more in detail. And I don't know, maybe, and that would be also one of the ways to kind of address the issues related to the structure that you were just highlighting.
I think, I mean, if people are including their comments, like what Anne said about the subgroups, etc., in the the collaborative document, then, you know, this session is actually pulling together a lot of the observations and experiences which probably need to be pulled together and summarized to take forward. You know, things like the special interest groups that Ingrid was mentioning, but also some of the other experiences that people have come forward with, because this is a really helpful discussion, I feel.
And you mentioned in the chat that there was this notion of crisis with COVID-19, and it doesn't exist, or it wouldn't exist with climate change. And I don't know, I live in Kiev, Ukraine, and we had a sandstorm, which was like very, very heavy sandstorm in the middle of Europe, in the middle of the continent, and that was quite a disaster. So I don't know, I'm afraid there might be some pressing issues in the climate change area as well. And I think it was also a good point that Brian mentioned in the beginning, that a lot of people who contributed to the paper haven't really been part of RDA before, and that now they are a part of RDA and contribute to other activities. And I think this engagement element is also important. And then if we look beyond and the second part of our today's discussion, could RDA play a strategic role in the future? How does this connect with the work of RDA in support of sustainable development goals? How this experience shared could be useful, or how could it be shared more widely? And should we pick on some regional activities? Could this be a blueprint for some regional activities? So then again, topical and regional. And Hugh mentioned that it was also fun to be part of that, and I second that part, because that was one of the reasons why I get involved. I really enjoyed working with Brian and with Ingrid and Claudia and other people. And please, Natalie.
I just wanted to note, you guys probably know this, but in terms of that first bullet question there about RDA playing a strategic role, so there is a community of practice for infectious diseases being set up. We had the first meeting of it yesterday, and community of practice is a new mechanism within RDA that's meant to be sort of broader and bring in different groups and perspectives. So that's one way forward, but I think we're trying to figure out how that community of practice will operate. Like, will we be spinning off particular working groups out of it, etc. So I put that in the notes, but that's just a point there. But I guess not all global emergencies are going to be infectious diseases. We have a lot more other global emergencies to look forward to. Okay.
Thank you.
I think that point also, they don't necessarily have to be global ones. I think we had a parallel discussion about regional activities that could fit this this sort of framework, and how these don't necessarily need to be an emergency, but might be just regional challenges that can be addressed. And from that point of view, RDA can also be in support of its regional membership. Yeah. So.
Yeah, and that's what community aspect comes in, because we can bring this community input and contribution to regional activities. And please, Karen.
Yeah, so I think that what Timia said and what we was talking about, in how can RDA help in that strategic sense. Another group that I'm involved in, called Great Swan Skill, they're thinking about the same thing, that group's come around looking at sensing what's likely to happen, and what, being able to see what kind of crisis might emerge and what kind of thinking might need to be in place to do that. So there's similar discussions in that group, and some of the things that they're gravitating towards is a few themes around. One is, so we got a group of experts here who can think through and provide guidance and advice as a preemptive thing. And another, so that was one stream. Another stream was saying, we got a group of experts here who can be called upon when something happens to come together to contribute and solve something. And because we don't know what those sort of crisis emergency situations are ahead of time, it's really hard to have those structures in place in terms of, we have the infectious disease. If there's another infectious disease happens, brilliant, we got the community of practice to work with it. But what if it's something else? We might not have that. But as an organization, if we have the structures to bring the people together, just like we did when the COVID hit and we brought everybody together, having those structures in place so that we can rapidly respond to it and tap into this network of 11,000 data experts around the world, I think that's going to be the way to do it, or one way at least to consider doing that. So RDA as an organization being ready to ready to respond when, say, the EU or a regional crisis happens, and so there is a need for drawing on the expertise or a subset of the expertise in here. We can do the call out, bring the people together, and respond to it.
Thanks a lot. Please, Hugh.
Yeah, I think Kieran kind of raised an important point there. I mean, the impetus for us to write the report was initially that Hillary got approached by the European Commission saying, well, you guys know about this, you should write something. And I was like, okay, go, do it. And likewise, one of the things that we probably need to think about is also, if we're talking about things like, regional activities or other things, is also to about where is that going to be picked up by other organizations. And, so kind of really say, is this, there's no point in us writing a document which then gets put up somewhere and nobody ever reads again. It really should be able to say, okay, here's the audience, and we kind of have a clear strategy saying this is what we'll do in terms of in terms of who actually receives those reports. I mean, academic publications, there's that, getting back to extrinsic stuff, that it has its own sort of reasons for people to get involved in. But if we want to be useful in what we do, we should think about that endpoint customer and almost kind of approach relevant organizations, say, look, if we did a report on X, would you use it? You know, it's perhaps another way of thinking about that.
Thanks a lot. Please, Anne.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Yeah. I would like to just on what was said about the European Commission asking RDA and so on. I think that this has played a very big role in a number of people, and we have to be realistic. They didn't join RDA for joining RDA. They joined RDA because this was the route you had to take to participate in this activity. And the fact that, at least for Europeans, the fact that the European Commission was asking for that played a big role. I don't know how is the process for RDA. Have you seen many members just getting out of RDA, or is this a rare case? Because my feeling is that a number of people wanted to contribute because of that, but are not specifically interested in RDA globally. I'm sorry to say that, but I think it's true. And do we have, for example, every 2 years an email coming to us asking, you are a member of RDA, do you still wish to continue? Because we are building on this 11,000 and so on, but that there are not 11,000 active ones. So I'm questioning here, how can we be a group of active experts that can be for a time and that not I can get out of RDA? But well, you are there, you even forget about it sometimes, and you appear as well being one of these 11,000 experts being there. So I'm questioning that, because I know that from the point of view specifically of a number of clinicians who participated at that, well, they are not going to participate in something else, for some of them at least. So I don't know what is the process in RDA to be sure that people who are there voluntarily want to continue to be there, and it's not enough to say you can get out whenever you want.
Thanks. And Francois also wrote in the chat whether we know if any people who participate in COVID-19 activities provide active contribution to the RDA. Did we ask anything like this in the survey, Brian, about contributing to other RDA activities?
Not that I remember. I mean, we did ask within the recommendation, the data sharing recommendations, we asked how many different groups people were part of. So that was an optional question. And apart from, are you a new member or an existing member, and something about the time they'd spent, we didn't go into that particularly.
Yeah, and for Natalie, we have Mary from the Secretariat with us, so she's watching the chat. And
can I just briefly pick up on a couple of points that have been made?
Yes, please.
You know, we do have this fantastic resource in RDA with all of these experts. The European Commission came and said, you know, please write some recommendations. And I agree with what was said in the chat. Are they actually using those? But I think the more important point is that the RDA were then free to produce a piece of work without it being perceived that it was a mouthpiece for the European Commission. Because of course, at the same time, they did various things with data protection, etc., which was not helpful. But I think going forward, that's really important. There is resource, there is expertise in the RDA, but every time that an organization comes and asks to use that resource, it's important that that should be independent. There should be no agenda coming forward from that organization. And that also goes to the last point there about the blueprint for regional activities. I think that's right. I think there's a lot of scope for regional areas to pick up what we've done and apply it in different contexts for their area, for things which are important to their area. But that needs to come back somehow to the rest of RDA. So there is an exception, an expectation and a perception that that work is important in its own right, but it's important to the rest of the community as well.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Moni, for writing a comment about importance of local activities for local chapters as well. Timea?
Yeah, so just picking up on a little bit of one dimension of what Brian. These things need to go back to the RDA. This, I think, connects also to the idea of what we see as active participation and the value of RDA. So you don't have to be actively contributing to something. If there is work, just the fact that you see RDA as a reference for similar activities, and you check in every once in a while, and you're a good observer of what's best practice and what other people are doing to address similar things, there's value in that as well. So I think that the idea of active shouldn't be overstated, because being active can mean different things, and participation, even as an observer, is extremely valuable.
Thanks a lot, Sarah, and thanks, Mary, for responding in the chat, Sarah. Maybe we could go to the last part of our discussion, and that's about next steps. And I think we will already discuss that it would be good to check how many active COVID-19 contributors keep being active in the RDA here. And then we also identified a couple of bullet points when we were planning this meeting. For example, should we have a membership survey where we could better understand the RDA dynamics, especially now, what are the drivers and motivations for contributing to this voluntary work? Then another bullet point that we put, do we want to write some recommendations or position paper on the improvements to the process, how this community contribution could be leveraged or could be, I don't know, actively sought for and included in further activities. And then analysis of the RDA outputs and recommendations to highlight the value they bring to international organizations like the UN and OECD. And there will be a joint RDA and OECD workshop on Friday. So we'll have some responses to this question, but what about UN organizations, for example? And these were just some of suggestions that we had when we were planning this session. And thanks, Brian.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, Ingvild, but I think that there is already some work that the SDG group is doing that might be relevant in this context. Do you think that? Oh, I don't know if we've lost Inga.
Yeah, it's really hard to say.
Oh no, there you go.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes.
You mean with regard to the survey?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
more on the systematic analysis. I know that there's already some work, but perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Well, there is, but we're really then targeted towards the SDGs. So what we presented yesterday, so basically we tried the one with the survey, and the idea was to do a more extensive survey to map this, but with regard to actually how the working and interest groups align themselves with the SDGs. However, we're working on a more kind of using the method of triangulation, because it turns out that it was very difficult to get proper feedback with the survey. So we are analyzing outputs, and then we have the tool that was presented yesterday that will be available in a beta version end of the month, developed by Devika and her team on semantic ontology on the SDGs, which we hope can be a tool which makes it easier for the working and interest groups members to see how it aligns. And then, of course, the next step would still be, what do we do with it in terms of all the points we've discussed so far in the session today, how we can use that to also show what the RDA is doing with regard to the SDGs and the global challenges, because it all goes back to the global challenges and how we can contribute and help and support external actors in particular to fulfill the SDGs.
Thanks a lot, Ingvill.
I saw the presentation, and I think that you have like a very clear analysis of how the RDA outputs and recommendations support well the work on the SDGs. I was curious if like something like a value proposition from the community participation point of view would fit into that. But yeah.
I think that's an excellent idea, and I would just encourage everybody who has time and the opportunity. We're having an open meeting next Wednesday, and I think if we can map our experience and into the SDG work, that's actually would be great. It's going to be a 2 UTC, and the link are in the minutes from the meeting. And also, I hope I've sent the link to the council, hoping that maybe they could distribute it also for everybody who want to participate. But I can include it in the minutes here too.
That would be very helpful. Thanks a lot, Ingvill. If you could add a link to our minutes as well. Yeah, but I can imagine that it could be a community effort to populate this, I don't know how you call it, a database with where you have SDGs and then RDA outputs and recommendations, because we come from different areas, and together we could provide a more comprehensive picture, and we know about specific uses of these recommendations. Then I think we have a consensus that it would be good to discuss some kind of membership. I don't know whether survey is a good word. Going back to RDA members and try to understand better their motivations and why they're contributing. And there is already an RDA membership survey going on, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Is that the survey that I mentioned yesterday or the other day, whatever day it was? Yeah, there is a survey. It's mostly to ask people about their opinions on the possibility of introducing an individual membership fee, because we know this is not a thing that would be without controversy, but we're trying to find a way to fund RDA. So yeah, that's what that's about. It would be great, and you can put anything in that, but it's not a survey about every aspect of membership.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free, we left the fields open so you can write a novel if you want.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. And then the second bullet point about recommendations or position paper on the community contributions. Because I think even from today's discussion, it's not very obvious for everyone what it means to be contributing to RDA, and some people are afraid to join because they think it's really a heavy effort that would take a lot of time. Although even like a minimum contribution would be very much welcomed, and then some people think that if they can't attend plenaries, it also means that they can't be part of RDA. That's almost like a must. If you're an RDA member, you should be attending plenaries, but of course it's not.
I think that these outputs were sort of, or suggestions for outputs were sort of mapped to how we structured the questions. So things that would be relevant internally for RDA, and things that would be, well, relevant for RDA to do, but to the in order to interact with the outside world. So yeah, I think that there's always a risk with the survey, because we had a good response, but not an excellent one for the survey to the paper yet. A lot of good information has come in, and I think the social scientists in the group would have expanded that much further, and it would be useful to get feedback, not only in the context of the COVID-19 exercise, but more in general on all these topics. There's been quite an active conversation about the word, what it means to be an active member to the RDA. So I think those would be very useful insights. And looking into the drivers and the motivation and all these sort of things, I think such an analysis would be very useful for RDA.
Yeah, and even who is a community, because sometimes we call a community RDA community, sometimes we use the word community when we think about people beyond RDA whom we want to ask about some RDA outputs. So it also depends on the context very much. So we have 6 minutes left, and
are there any other questions? Or any suggestions? So by all means, feel free to, if you don't want to speak up, feel free to contact any of us. Where we have worked in a smaller group on the radical collaboration paper. So, but that can be well, an entry point if we decide to take this any further. Go ahead, Anne. I see you.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I mentioned in the note that already, but I can say it openly there. I in the SHARC sharing rewards and credit group of RDA that had a session on the 20th. We are talking about how to make a recommendation or something useful for taking into account the work behind open science in general, or sharing data, recognized in the evaluation of research activity as a research output. So that's basically what the group is about. And there I had the opportunity to present the discussion, at least those I participated in the RDA group, COVID-19, about how to recognize the work that was being put in by all these people. And we had different kinds of discussion, and Kiran just mentioned some of them before. And think that it could be useful that the community participation and or the social science group or moderators at least get into contact with the SHARC group, because taking into account in at least academic or general evaluation of activity, the work that you do for the community is something which is not always easy to put in, and specifically in these international organization activities. And we could have good exchange, I think, on what kind of recommendation could be done for that. That was all. Thank you for a great session.
Thanks a lot, Anne, and we'll share this with other social sciences and community participation working group members. That's an important point. Any other reflections, suggestions? Anything else we can do as a community? And thanks Amelia and Timea and Brian and also many other people who put this session together. Thanks a lot for joining the discussion today. That was very useful for me, and I think that's what we had in mind. So as organizers, I think we're happy, and I hope you're also happy as participants. And then see you at other RDA sessions, and thanks again for joining.
Thank you, Timea. Thank you, Irina.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye. And I think we have a way to capture chat, because it would be good to add the chat to the minutes.
Yeah, I just tried to copy it, but it didn't work.